We are nearing the end of the confirmation program with our young people, and we are also getting near the end of our sermon series that has been sort of joining them along the way about what matters most in our faith. The last 4 weeks, we've been using this book called What's the Least I Can Believe and Still Be a Christian? A Guide to What Matters Most. And just to catch everyone up, if you can go back and you can watch all the sermons on YouTube if you like, but to catch everybody up, here's where we've been. What matters most was our first question. The answer is love. Our next question was, am I accepted? The answer is yes, by God's grace. Then we asked the question, where is God? And discovered that God is everywhere, but not just everywhere. We are God's hands and feet in the world. So when we ask, where is God? God is in us. Last week we tackled a tough question. What about suffering? And we found that there's no easy answers to suffering, but we found that we do not suffer alone, that God's compassion means that God suffers with us. Today, we're going to swing in a whole different direction from suffering to joy, to ask the question, what brings joy and fulfillment in life? What gives life meaning and purpose? And the answer, unlike last week's about suffering, which was a hard one, this week's answer is a simple one. It's not money or fame or power. It's not life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The answer to what brings fulfillment is generous service. We find this to be a reoccurring theme throughout Jesus and the Gospels. Over and over again, Jesus invites people to turn from a life of selfishness to a life of selflessness. And I'll give you a few examples quickly. Jesus tells his disciples after they've declared that he's the Messiah, he says for them to deny themselves and take up their cross. And he says, for those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose it for my sake will save it. In other words, if you live for yourself, that's a life lost. If you live for others, it's a life gained. And then there was a time that Jesus says to this rich ruler who asked about seeking eternal life and what that was all about. And Jesus said to him, there's still one thing you're lacking. So you see, he'd kept all the rules. He had done all the proper things. Jesus says, one thing you're lacking. Sell all that you have and distribute the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. Or there was a time that Jesus saw a whole bunch of wealthy people putting their gifts into the temple treasury, and Jesus points out one small gift, the small gift of a poor widow. And he says to his disciples, truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in all she had to live on. And then there was the time when Jesus' disciples were arguing over which one of them was the greatest. And Jesus interrupts the argument and says to them, whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. Just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. Over and over again, Jesus guides us to living generous lives of service to others. That's what he taught, and that's what he lived. And he knew that that is the true way for us to find fulfillment in life. But nowhere is his example more powerful than in the text that Mariah read for us today. Unlike all the stories that I've just told you, which you will find in all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Gospels, you will only find the story of Jesus washing his disciples' feet in the Gospel of John. The story takes place during the Last Supper, Jesus' last meal with his disciples before he is crucified. And you will likely recall that during that meal, Jesus took bread and broke it. He took a cup of wine and blessed it. And he gave those things to the disciples and said to them, "Do this, take this, and remember me." The bread and the wine, Jesus was giving them as signs and symbols for what he was about to do, the selfless and generous act of giving his life for our sin. Yet for some reason, that's such an important story to our faith. And yet for some reason, the Gospel of John just kind of skips over that whole part. It doesn't include it as part of the story of that Last Supper. Instead, John tells us about how Jesus took the role of a servant, knelt down, and washed his disciples' feet. And when he did that, he said to them, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if your Lord and teacher have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example that you also should do as I have done to you." It kind of amazes me that communion is a sacrament that we take about once a month here. Some churches do it more than that. But somehow foot washing, this beautiful, powerful, humble thing that Jesus did, is not something even on our radar. I mean, there are some notable examples of foot washing in our world. The first that comes to mind, it was back in April when the Pope Francis washed the feet of inmates out of prison in Italy. And the Pope told the inmates, he knows that washing someone else's feet can seem like a strange thing today. But he said it's a reminder of Jesus, who teaches us, and he says, this is simple. You have to wash each other's feet, one serving the other, without self-interest. Just because, though, washing feet is not some big fancy sacrament in our church, I don't want you to let that diminish in your mind the sacramental nature of generous service. Because truly, generous service is at the core of what it means to be a follower of Christ. Sure, we may not wash each other's feet very often, if at all, but every time that we give generously of our time, every time we give generously of our skill, every time that we give generously of our resources, it is like we are tying that towel around our waist and we are stooping down to wash someone's feet. And when we do that, Jesus says we are fulfilling his command to do as he has done for us. And there is great satisfaction and great fulfillment and joy in service to others. I'm sure you've experienced that before in your life when you've done something for someone else and maybe it was a big effort, a big sacrifice on your part, but you felt so good for doing it. The fact is that generous service is what gives life to the church. It's what gives the church its vitality and its spirit. There's a theologian, Emil Brunner, and he once said that a flame exists by burning, as a flame exists by burning, so the church exists by mission. As a flame exists by burning, so the church exists by mission. In other words, if you take generous service out of the church, you don't have a church anymore. Generous service is that fuel that keeps the light of Christ burning in our hearts. And so to illustrate just how that kind of works, I wanted to share this short story from the book, What's the Least I Can Believe, about another church that found great fulfillment and joy in generous service to its community. Several years ago, a United Methodist church in North Carolina learned about the joy of service, both individually and as a community. This church, concerned about homeless people in their community, especially during the winter months, spearheaded a program to help. And they, along with 14 other churches in the city, committed to care for homeless people for 1 week each winter, each church for about 18 to 20 homeless guests. Their job was to provide them with a warm and safe place to sleep, meals, and other needs for the entire week. And so, as we like to do, there was a committee. And so in early November, the cooperating churches had their final organizational meeting. And the purpose of that meeting was to just schedule a specific week for each congregation to host. Now, the United Methodist pastor planned to go to the meeting, but she was busy. And so she asked a woman from her church to go in her place. Now, this woman was a new Christian and new church member and super enthusiastic and devoted to this cause. And so the pastor gave her a list of convenient weeks in January and February that worked for their congregation to care for the homeless group. And the pastor told her, make sure to schedule us for one of these weeks. You might know what's going to happen here. The woman went to the meeting, but not long into the meeting, they reached an impasse. Not one of the 15 cooperating churches was willing to take Christmas week. First, it interfered with all their Christmas activities, including their Christmas Eve services. Second, everybody knew that their members would not want to cook meals and provide other services for homeless folks during the Christmas holidays. This woman, an enthusiastic new believer, was dumbfounded. She could not believe that none of the churches would take Christmas week. And the more they argued about it, who was going to have to take Christmas, the madder she got. And before she knew it, she smashed her hand down on the table, stood up, and gave a speech. I can't believe how she, in front of a whole bunch of ministers, this is awesome. I can't believe this, she exclaimed. Jesus and his family were homeless in Bethlehem on the very first Christmas, and yet not one church in this community is willing to care for homeless people during the week of Christmas. Shame on you. The pastors felt ashamed. Of course, not ashamed enough to volunteer for the week of Christmas. And so when nobody volunteered, this lay woman boldly proclaimed, my church, the First United Methodist Church, will take Christmas week, not only this year, but every year. One of the pastors said, so moved. Another said, I'll second that. And after a quick vote, the meeting was adjourned. Now, after the meeting was over, this woman went to see her pastor. She was excited. She said, I have great news. Our church gets to care for homeless people during the week of Christmas, not only this year, but every year. Isn't that great? Well, that wasn't exactly great news to the pastor. And what about their Christmas Eve services? How would they find volunteers to cook and care for homeless people during the holidays? No, this was not good news at all to the pastor. In fact, she was sorry she had not gone to the meeting herself. But what could she do? It was done. Next Sunday, pastor gave the news to her congregation. She said, "We are going to host homeless people during the week of Christmas, and we need a bunch of volunteers to help." She didn't think she would get any response, but she was wrong. People came out of the woodwork to volunteer. Families with young children volunteered, saying to the pastor, "We want our kids to know there's more to Christmas than just gifts." And then families who had lost loved ones during the year volunteered, hoping to fill that void of the Christmas season. And in fact, the pastor got more volunteers than she could use. Christmas week finally arrived. 18 homeless people came to the Methodist Church to spend the week. And much to this pastor's surprise, it ended up being the highlight of the year for the church. People brought tons of food all week long. The homeless guests ate like kings and queens. The church members also brought nice clothes and coats for them to wear. They brought gifts for everyone, especially the children. And they didn't just give food and clothes and gifts, they also gave of themselves as well. They stayed for hours to visit with the group. They ate meals with them and played games with them. They even had a marathon, 3-day-long Monopoly tournament, which is kind of weird, playing a game about buying property with homeless people, but it worked for them. Many members spent one or more nights during that week. The church members got to know these people as real people. And although they weren't required to go, all 18 of the homeless guests went to the Christmas Eve candlelight communion service, and they were warmly welcomed by the entire congregation, and everyone in attendance had this holy moment. In fact, the whole week was a holy moment and turned out to be this glorious experience for the church, and it continued to be that way for the next 5 Christmases. Now, this story has a little unusual ending, because after 6 Christmases of hosting homeless folks during that week of Christmas, the Methodist pastor got a phone call from the Baptist pastor. And he said, "You know, everyone in this town has heard about how much fun your church has hosting the homeless group at Christmas. So we were wondering, would you be willing to share that week with some of the other churches? Don't be hogging it all to yourselves. We were hoping we could do Christmas this year." That congregation learned something profound through that experience. They learned that the answer to the question, what brings fulfillment, is not living for yourself, but living for others. Because when we're truly generous with all that we have, Jesus says that our reward is treasure in heaven, the gift of an abundant and filled life. And so my prayer for you individually and for this congregation, for all the congregations in our community, is that as we serve the community around us, whether it's through our different programs like Messy Church or Tuesday luncheons, or as you are volunteering in the different community programs that you're involved in, or as we're hosting concerts here to benefit the hospital and Woolwich Counseling Center, or as you're attending events in the community in support of food banks and other important causes, or as we're giving to things like PWS&D and Presbyterian Sharing, or the other charities that are near and dear to your heart. My hope is that as we serve others with generous hearts and generous hands, that we would all find that fulfillment that only comes from serving others in the name of Christ, the one who stooped down to wash his disciples' feet. May our generous service be to us a sacrament, filling us with great joy and great peace. In the name of Christ. Amen.